Michael Ross, is there a strategy for the U.S. in how diplomatically it deals with China when China is out pursuing wherever it can the oil it can get?
Well, there are a couple of things that the United States can do. The U.S., both the government and non-governmental organizations, nonprofit groups, have been trying to place pressure on the Chinese government to bring up and pay more attention to human rights issues when it deals with the governments of Burma and Sudan and other countries. And so we can use some diplomatic pressure. There's even some evidence that that the Chinese government is becoming more interested in these approaches and taking a look at these approaches. So that's one thing we can do. But a second thing we could do is try to work more aggressively with China's leadership to promote energy-saving technologies and to help them become more fuel efficient as well, so that they too are less dependent on oil and gas exports from countries that are human rights violators.
Let's turn and talk a little bit, Jim Robbins, about how high oil prices are affecting oil-producing countries as opposed to the consumers of oil. Is the increased wealth coming into these countries likely to hasten positive development in those countries, or is it likely to add to their woes?
Probably a mix of both. I think with respect to global security, we've seen a resurgence of Russia that's based mainly on natural resources, particularly the rise in energy prices. It allowed Russia to sort of reclaim a role on the world stage that it previously hadn't had. When you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, I doubt that it's going to help with their internal development any more than it already has. Countries like Iran are placing emphasis on the military side more than on social development, so it's probably not going to benefit them as much. Maybe other countries it will. When you look at Venezuela, for example, they're not going to benefit very much from it because they're putting in place socialist policies that will probably wreck their economy in other respects. So I'd see more challenges and more woes from this windfall than any kind of responsible development plans, such as they've put in place in Norway, for example, or some of the other North Sea oil countries that have benefited from this.
Now, recently, President George W. Bush was in the Middle East, and he addressed this issue of oil and the economies of the Middle East. And let's hear what he had to say.
The rising price of oil has brought great wealth to some in this region, but the supply of oil is limited. And nations like mine are aggressively developing alternatives to oil. Over time, as the world becomes less dependent on oil, nations in the Middle East will have to build more diverse and more dynamic economies.
Michael Ross, is your sense that with this increased oil wealth at this point that the nations of the Middle East are looking for diverse and dynamic economies, or are those economies becoming sort of more focused on just that one export?
It's very difficult at a time of rising oil prices for these countries to really diversify their economy. They're certainly making investments in different kinds of industries and developing new infrastructure, even building new cities, as Saudi Arabia is doing. But diversification right now is going to be very tough because their economies are so overwhelmed with oil revenues that it's hard to get any other kinds of business going. Now, there's an interesting irony, though, in President Bush's speech. In that same speech, he chastised the Middle Eastern countries for their lack of democracy and for not having not promoting women's rights, not giving women many economic opportunities. And both of those shortcomings for many Middle Eastern countries are directly the result of having so much oil. When countries like the Persian Gulf states get these huge oil windfalls, it helps non-democratic governments stay in power and buy off any kind of democratic opposition. It also tends to provide women with very few economic opportunities. Things like the oil business and the construction business are booming, but those provide jobs for men. And oil-based economies provide very few opportunities for women. So I think the pleasures of having all of this oil wealth are also often tied to the dangers for democracy and for women's rights that we see in these countries.
Jim Robbins, what's your sense on that?
I'd say the same thing. Also an increase in corruption, because a lot of these governments tend to be authoritarian, and so they direct the way that oil profits flow, and generally through crony networks or things like that. It tends to be highly corrupting. I think the infusion of greater amounts of money into systems like that do not tend to increase responsibility, but rather the opposite. They tend to increase graft and corruption, and perhaps they could make these governments more unstable, although they seem to be adept at buying off opposition groups, as Mike mentioned, and yet supporting their own power.
One of the big policy pushes in Africa and the Middle East, and all by the U.S., has been to push for good governance and rule of law. And so does this increase in oil wealth counteract that policy effort?
Surely. A lot of good governance and rule of law starts with things like reforming tax laws and the rights of property and things like that. And in oil mono-economies or energy mono-economies, you don't tend to get a lot of respect for those kinds of things, because the state tends to control the main source of national income. And so notions of private property leading to the development of a middle class, these kinds of traditional liberal notions just don't come into play as much, because the bottom line question, as it is in Iraq, becomes who controls the oil revenue and what direction will it flow? That's one of the main things that's keeping Iraq from moving forward politically, is they can't come to an agreement on that. However, the fact that they're at least debating it, as opposed to shooting each other over it or having a dictator tell them which way it's going, might provide a roadmap for the future.